Thunder cracked through the clear Montana sky as Liliana Summers clutched her mother's frayed shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wind whipping her auburn hair into a wild tangle as she watched her mother's casket being lowered into the rocky earth. At 22, she was now alone in the unforgiving frontier town of Copper Creek. 1876, with nothing but a failing general store, mounting debts, and a 10-year-old brother who wasn't even her blood kin. "Miss Summers," Banker Holloway's voice slithered through the air just as the last mourner departed the windswept cemetery. "My condolences. When might we discuss your mother's outstanding obligations?" Liliana's spine stiffened. "My mother isn't even in the ground yet, Mr. Holloway." "The bank doesn't operate on sentiment, I'm afraid." His eyes darted to the small boy standing beside her, his hand clutched in hers. "And what of the boy? Thomas isn't your true kin." "The orphanage in Helena would—" "Thomas stays with me," Liliana cut him off, her voice as sharp as a newly forged blade. "My mother took him in when no one else would, and I'll honor her wishes." Thomas pressed closer to her side, his thin frame trembling not from the autumn chill, but from the fear that had haunted him since they'd found her mother cold in her bed 3 days prior. He wasn't her blood brother, but in the 4 years since her mother had taken him in after finding him half-starved behind their store, he'd become her family all the same. The banker's expression soured. "Very well. You have until the end of the month to settle accounts." He tipped his hat, the gesture more threatening than courteous, before striding away. Thomas looked up at her, his blue eyes wide with worry. "Are they going to take me away, Lily?" Liliana knelt down, brushing a lock of sandy hair from his forehead. "Not while I'm breathing, little fox. We're family, and family sticks together." But as they walked back toward town, the weight of her promise felt impossibly heavy. The general store had been struggling for months. Her mother had been quietly selling off their possessions just to keep food on the table. Now, with winter approaching and creditors circling, Liliana wasn't sure how she'd keep her word. 3 days later, Liliana stood behind the counter of Summers' general store, tallying the day's meager earnings. Thomas sat in the corner, repairing a chair leg with the careful precision her mother had taught him. The bell above the door jangled, and both their heads snapped up. Preston Palmer filled the doorway like he belonged there, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame. At 28, he was already something of a legend in Copper Creek and the surrounding territory. The stories about him varied. Some said he'd ridden with a band of notorious outlaws before going straight. Others claimed he'd been a cavalry scout during the recent conflicts with the Sioux. What everyone agreed on was that he was the best horseman in 3 territories and had a way with troubled stock that bordered on supernatural. "Miss Summers," he said, removing his weathered hat to reveal dark hair in need of a trim. His voice was deep and rough, like he didn't use it often. "I'm here about the advertisement." Liliana blinked in confusion. "Advertisement? For the room to let." He gestured toward the faded paper in the window, yellowed with age. "Says room and board in exchange for help around the store." Her heart sank. Her mother had placed that advertisement months ago, then forgotten about it as her illness progressed. "Mr. Palmer, I'm afraid Preston," he corrected. "Or Press, if you prefer." "Mr. Palmer," she continued firmly. "That notice is outdated. My mother passed last week and I'm reassessing our situation." Something flickered in his eyes, sympathy, perhaps, but not pity. "My condolences, Miss Summers. Your mother was a fair woman." Thomas had abandoned his work and moved closer, studying the tall stranger with undisguised curiosity. Preston nodded at the boy, the barest hint of a smile softening his otherwise stern features. "All the same," Preston continued, "I'm looking for lodging and you look like you could use a hand." His gaze swept over the store, noting the empty shelves, the patched roof, the cracked window pane held together with paper and glue. Liliana felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We're managing just fine." "Course you are," he agreed easily. "But winter's coming early this year. Saw the signs when I was bringing horses down from the high country." Store needs weatherproofing, chimney needs sweeping, and those roof patches won't hold against heavy snow." Before Liliana could respond, the door banged open again, and 3 boys from town burst in, jostling each other and laughing. They headed straight for the candy jars, but stopped short when they spotted Thomas. "Well, if it isn't the orphan brat," sneered the tallest, Harold Whittaker, the blacksmith's 15-year-old son. Thomas stiffened but said nothing, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Heard your not mama died," another boy chimed in. "Reckon they'll ship you off to the orphanage now, where you belong." "That's enough," Liliana said sharply. "Buy something or leave, boys." Harold ignored her, sidling closer to Thomas. "What's the matter, foundling? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just stupid like they say. Left on a doorstep cause even your real mama knew you wasn't right in the head." Thomas's hands balled into fists at his sides, but he remained silent, trembling with the effort of restraint. "I said that's enough," Liliana repeated, coming around the counter. But before she could reach them, Preston moved with surprising speed for a man his size. He positioned himself between the boys and Thomas, his back to the child, facing the bullies with a calm that seemed more menacing than any show of anger. "Store's closing," he said quietly. "Time for you to go." Harold puffed up his chest. "My pa says your pa knows me," Preston cut him off. "Ask him about the time I broke up that fight at the Rusty Nail. Ask him if he thinks it's wise to test my patience." The boys exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain. Preston didn't raise his voice or make any threatening moves, but something in his stillness made the boys back toward the door. "He's just a stupid orphan anyway," Harold muttered, but the bluster had gone out of him. As they shuffled out, Preston turned to Thomas, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears of humiliation. Without a word, Preston removed his hat, a fine, well-worn Stetson that had clearly seen many miles, and placed it gently on Thomas's head. It was comically large, slipping down to cover his eyes. "There," Preston said, adjusting it slightly. "Every man needs a good hat, son." Thomas pushed the brim up with one finger, looking at Preston with a mixture of confusion and wonder. "But it's yours." "Got another," Preston shrugged. "That one suits you better anyway." Liliana watched the exchange, something warm and unexpected uncurling in her chest. It had been a simple gesture, but the tender dignity with which Preston had treated Thomas, calling him son so casually, as if he belonged to someone, as if he mattered, made her throat tighten. "The room," she found herself saying. "It's small, just the attic space above the store, but it's clean, and I can offer breakfast and dinner in exchange for help with repairs and deliveries." Preston turned to her, surprise briefly crossing his features before he nodded. "Seems fair." "I cook," she added quickly. "And Thomas is handy with repairs despite what those boys think." "Never doubted it." Preston glanced at Thomas, who was still admiring the hat. "Hat like that comes with responsibility, though. Means you're the man of the house when I'm not around." "Think you can handle that?" Thomas nodded solemnly, standing a little straighter. That evening, as Liliana prepared a simple stew from what little they had, she watched through the kitchen window as Preston showed Thomas how to properly groom a horse. The massive buckskin gelding that Preston had ridden into town stood patiently as the boy carefully brushed its coat, still wearing the oversized hat that threatened to swallow his small face. Something about the scene made her pause, wooden spoons suspended over the pot. It had been just the 3 of them, her mother, and Thomas, for so long that the addition of Preston's tall figure in their small yard felt strange, yet not unwelcome. Like a missing piece she hadn't known was absent. Over the following weeks, Preston proved his worth 100 times over. He rose before dawn each day, repaired the roof, reinforced the windows against the coming winter, and split enough firewood to last through the coldest months. He delivered orders to outlying homesteads that Liliana would have struggled to reach, bringing back news and occasionally fresh game for their table. Word spread that Preston Palmer was working at Summers' general store, and business picked up. Men who'd previously taken their trade to the larger establishment at the other end of town began stopping in, ostensibly to purchase supplies but really to exchange words with Preston or hear his quiet assessments of their horses and cattle. Even more surprising was how he handled Thomas. Preston never spoke down to the boy or treated him with the false cheerfulness that many adults reserved for children. Instead, he taught Thomas practical skills: how to judge a horse's health by the look in its eye, how to predict weather changes from the way smoke rose from chimneys, how to stand and speak so that others would listen. "The hat's working," Liliana commented one evening as she and Preston sat on the store's small porch after Thomas had gone to bed. The first snow of the season was falling, soft flakes illuminated by the golden light spilling from the windows. Preston raised an eyebrow in question. "Those boys haven't bothered him since that day," she explained. "And Mrs. Peterson actually complimented him yesterday when he helped carry her parcels." "Wasn't the hat," Preston said. "It's him standing taller." Liliana studied his profile in the dim light. "Why did you really answer that advertisement? You could work anywhere. The Triple R has been trying to hire you for months, according to town gossip." Preston was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed, his breath visible in the cold air. "Saw myself in him, I suppose. Boy without roots, people deciding what he's worth based on where he came from rather than who he is." He paused. "And I was tired of moving on, wanted somewhere to stop for a while." The simple honesty of his words touched something in Liliana. For the first time, she allowed herself to really look at him not as the legendary horseman or the hired help, but as a man who understood what it meant to be adrift in the world. "Well," she said softly, "we're glad you stopped here." Their eyes met, and Liliana felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced before: a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits finding harbor in each other's company. But the moment was broken by the distant howl of a wolf, reminding them of the wild country that surrounded their small pocket of civilization. As November turned to December, Copper Creek prepared for its annual Christmas celebration. The town had little in the way of extravagance, but everyone contributed what they could: pine boughs for decoration, preserved fruits for desserts, and whatever small luxuries had been hoarded for the occasion. Liliana found herself looking forward to the festivities with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. The store was doing better, thanks in no small part to Preston's presence, and for the first time since her mother's death, she allowed herself to believe they might survive not just the winter, but beyond it. One afternoon, as she was arranging a display of candy sticks for the holiday, Banker Holloway entered the store. His eyes narrowed as he took in the new shelving Preston had built, the freshly swept floors, and the modest but noticeable increase in inventory. "Miss Summers," he greeted her with artificial warmth, "I see you've made some improvements." "Mr. Holloway," she acknowledged coolly, "what can I help you with today?" He removed a ledger from his coat. "I've come about your mother's loan. The grace period ends tomorrow." Liliana's heart sank. In the flurry of activity since Preston's arrival, she'd pushed the looming debt from her mind. "I thought we had until the end of the month." "The end of November," he corrected with a thin smile. "Today is December 20th, she swallowed hard. "How much?" When he named the figure, she felt the blood drain from her face. It was more than she'd anticipated, more than they had set aside despite the recent upturn in business. "I see," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'll need a day to gather the funds." Holloway's smile widened, revealing teeth as yellow as old ivory. "Of course. Though I should warn you, several parties have expressed interest in this property. Prime location, you see. The saloon owner is particularly keen to expand." After he left, Liliana stood frozen, the candy stick in her hand snapped in two. That was his game, then. He'd known she couldn't pay. He'd been planning to seize the store all along, probably had buyers lined up before her mother was even buried. Lily. Thomas's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He stood in the doorway to the back room, Preston's hat pushed back on his head. "Is everything all right?" She forced a smile. Of course, little fox, just thinking about what to make for dinner. But later that night, after Thomas was asleep, Liliana sat at the kitchen table with their ledger open before her, trying to find a solution where there wasn't one. They simply didn't have enough. Preston found her there, head in her hands, when he came in from his evening check on the horses. Without a word, he pulled out a chair and sat across from her, waiting. "We're going to lose the store," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Holloway's calling in my mother's loan tomorrow, and we don't have enough to cover it." Preston's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened slightly. "How much are you short?" she told him, the sum sounding even more impossible spoken aloud. To her surprise, Preston stood and went to his coat hanging by the door. From an inner pocket, he withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked softly as he placed it on the table between them. "What's this?" she asked. "Been saving," he said simply. "For land of my own someday, but that can wait." Liliana stared at the pouch, then back at him, shock and a wave of gratitude rendering her momentarily speechless. "Preston, I can't accept this. It's your future." He shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying more than words could. "Store is Thomas's future and yours." "I could never repay you," she protested weakly, even as hope surged within her. "Wasn't offered as a loan," he said quietly. Then, with the ghost of a smile, "Though I wouldn't say no to extra biscuits at breakfast now and then." Impulsively, Liliana reached across the table and took his hand. It was rough with calluses, warm despite the cold night air he'd just come in from. "Why would you do this for us?" Preston looked down at their joined hands, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "Because in 3 months, this has felt more like home than anywhere I've been in 20 years of wandering." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither was quite ready to voice. Liliana felt her heart beating wildly in her chest, aware that they had crossed some invisible boundary. "Then stay," she whispered. "Not just in the attic room, not just as help. Stay as family." The word seemed to startle him, his eyes lifting to meet hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. But before he could respond, a cry from upstairs broke the moment. "Thomas," Liliana said, rising quickly. "He's been having nightmares since Mother died." Preston nodded, withdrawing his hand. "Go to him. We'll talk more tomorrow." But the next day brought chaos instead of clarity. Liliana went to the bank early, Preston's savings combined with what she'd managed to scrape together just enough to cover the debt. Holloway couldn't hide his disappointment as he grudgingly marked the loan paid in full, muttering that he'd be watching for the tax payment come spring. She was walking back to the store, relief making her steps lighter than they'd been in months, when she heard the commotion. A crowd had gathered in the street outside Summers' general store, voices raised in alarm. Pushing through the onlookers, Liliana's heart stuttered at the sight that greeted her. Thomas lay on the ground, blood seeping from a cut on his forehead, Preston's hat crushed beneath him. Standing over him was Harold Whitaker and his friends, looking both defiant and frightened. "What happened?" she demanded, rushing to Thomas's side. "These boys thought it would be amusing to play a game of keep away with Thomas's hat," came Preston's voice, cold with controlled fury. He emerged from the store, a wet cloth in his hand which he passed to Liliana. When Thomas tried to get it back, they pushed him down. He hit his head on the hitching post. Liliana pressed the cloth to Thomas's wound, relief washing through her as he blinked up at her, dazed but conscious. "It's all right, little fox, I'm here now." Harold's father pushed through the crowd, his blacksmith's apron still tied around his substantial girth. "What's all this about my boy? Your son and his friends assaulted Thomas," Preston said evenly, "knocked him down and caused him injury." Whitaker scoffed. "Boys being boys, no harm meant." "There's blood on the ground that says different," Preston countered, his voice deceptively soft, the blacksmith's face darkened. "And who are you to judge my son's actions?" "Some drifter who showed up out of nowhere, living off a widow woman's charity? We all know what you're really after, Palmer." A murmur went through the crowd, and Liliana felt her cheeks burn with anger and embarrassment. Is that what people thought? That Preston was taking advantage of her vulnerability. "That's enough, Whitaker," came Sheriff Davis's voice as he shouldered his way to the center of the gathering. "What's going on here?" As the situation was explained, Liliana helped Thomas to his feet. The boy swayed slightly but remained standing, his eyes fixed on the crushed hat lying in the dirt. "I'm sorry, Mr. Preston," he said, his voice small. "I tried to take care of it like you said." Preston knelt down, picking up the damaged Stetson. With careful hands, he worked the worst of the dents out, then placed it back on Thomas's head. "You did just fine, son. Sometimes you can't avoid a fight, but you stood your ground. That's what matters." The simple dignity of the exchange silenced the murmuring crowd. Even Sheriff Davis paused in his questioning of the other boys to watch. "Now," Preston continued, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "we need to clean that cut properly. Your sister's going to help you inside, and I'll be right along once I finish talking with the sheriff." Thomas nodded, straightening his shoulders despite the pain clearly visible in his eyes. As Liliana led him toward the store, she heard Preston addressing the sheriff behind her. "Those boys need consequences, Sheriff. Thomas is under my protection, and I won't stand for him being mistreated." Under my protection. The words echoed in Liliana's mind as she tended to Thomas's wound in the kitchen. Preston had claimed them, in a way, publicly declaring his commitment to their welfare. The thought filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the stove. Later that evening, after Thomas had been put to bed with extra dessert to soothe his pride, Liliana found Preston on the porch again, staring up at the star-filled sky. "Thank you," she said, joining him, "for what you did today, for everything you've done since you arrived." Preston nodded, acknowledging her gratitude without turning from his contemplation of the heavens. "Thomas is a good boy, strong in the ways that matter. He adores you," Liliana said softly. "You've given him something I couldn't a man to look up to learn from." Now Preston did look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You've given him love and stability, that counts for more. Perhaps children need both," she suggested, gathering her courage. "Perhaps we all do." Preston was silent for a long moment, and Liliana feared she'd overstepped. But then he shifted slightly, angling his body toward hers. "Last night," he began, his voice low and uncertain in a way she'd never heard from him before, "you mentioned family." "I did," she confirmed, her heart beginning to race again. "I've never had much in the way of family," he admitted. "Grew up in an orphanage myself until I was 12, then ran off with a cattle drive. Been moving ever since." "Until now," Liliana prompted gently. "Until now," he agreed. "Thing is, Liliana, I don't know how to be part of a family, but I'd like to learn if you're willing to teach me." The vulnerability in his admission moved her deeply. Impulsively, she reached up and touched his cheek, rough with stubble beneath her fingertips. "I think we could learn together." Something shifted in his expression, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Preston leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, a beginning rather than a demand. When they parted, Liliana found herself breathless, clinging to the front of his shirt. "I think," she whispered, "that you're a quicker study than you give yourself credit for." His answering smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, almost boyish in his happiness. It struck her that in all the weeks he'd been with them, she'd rarely seen him truly smile. "Does this mean you'll stay?" she asked. "Not just for the winter, but for good." Preston took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I've been looking for a place to belong my whole life. Never thought I'd find it in a run-down general store with a fiercely independent woman and a boy in an oversized hat." "Is that a yes?" Liliana pressed, needing to hear the words. "It's a yes," he confirmed. "For as long as you'll have me." Christmas in Copper Creek that year was remembered as one of the most joyous in the town's history. The storm that had threatened held off, leaving the streets covered in a pristine blanket of snow that glittered under clear skies. Every building was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and the community hall blazed with the light of 100 candles. But the most talked about event wasn't the feast or the music, or even old Mr. Henderson getting tipsy on spiked punch and trying to dance a jig. It was the moment when Preston Palmer, the legendary horseman who'd never stayed in one place longer than a season, got down on one knee in front of the whole town and asked Liliana Summers to marry him. Her yes was so enthusiastic she nearly knocked him over, causing laughter and cheers to erupt through the hall. Thomas, watching from nearby with Preston's refurbished hat still on his head, let out a whoop of joy and rushed to join them, Preston pulling him into the embrace with a natural ease that spoke of a bond already formed. They were married in the spring, just as the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom across the Montana prairie. The ceremony was simple but well attended, the entire town turning out to witness the union of the woman who'd faced down tragedy with quiet strength and the drifter who'd found his home at last. Preston's wedding gift to Liliana was the deed to the land adjacent to the store prime grazing land he'd purchased with money he'd been secretly saving since paying off Holloway's loan. His gift to Thomas was a colt from his prized buckskin, a spirited little creature that the boy immediately named Shadow for its dark coat. "Every man needs his own horse," Preston told him, "especially one who's going to help run a ranch someday." Thomas beamed, straightening the hat that, while still large, no longer swallowed his face entirely. In the months since Preston's arrival, the boy had grown not just in height but in confidence, the cruel taunts of the town boys now rolling off him like water off a duck's back. That night, after the celebrations had ended and Thomas had finally been convinced to go to bed despite his excitement, Liliana and Preston stood on the porch of what was now their home, looking out at the land that would soon support a small herd of horses, the beginning of the dream Preston had carried through years of wandering. "Happy, Mrs. Palmer?" Preston asked, his arm around her waist drawing her close against the evening chill. Liliana leaned into his solid warmth, savoring the new name that felt right in a way she hadn't expected. "More than I ever thought possible." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to tell him. "And I think I'll be even happier come winter." Preston glanced down at her, a question in his eyes. Liliana took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to need another hat." The wonder that bloomed across his face, followed by a joy so pure it brought tears to his eyes, was everything she'd hoped for. Preston dropped to his knees before her, pressing his forehead against where their child grew, his shoulders shaking with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with feeling, "for giving me a family, for making me a father twice over." Liliana ran her fingers through his dark hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "And thank you for stopping that day. For putting your hat on a lonely boy and calling him son. For showing us both what it means to be truly seen." Preston rose, gathering her in his arms with a tenderness that belied his strength. "That hat was the best investment I ever made," he murmured against her hair. "Bought me a son, a wife, and a future I never dared dream of." As the stars appeared one by one in the vast Montana sky, Liliana thought of the long journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey marked by loss and struggle, yes, but also by unexpected joy, and the kind of love that builds slowly, surely, like a house constructed to withstand the harshest of winters. From the small bedroom above, they could hear Thomas's soft snores, the boy sleeping peacefully beneath Preston's hat, which he still refused to part with even at night. Tomorrow they would tell him about the baby, watch his face light up with the news that their family was growing yet again. But for now, this moment was theirs alone, a quiet celebration of the fact that sometimes family isn't what you're born into, but what you build with your own hands, your own heart, and the courage to offer shelter to those who need it most. "I love you, Preston Palmer," Liliana whispered, the words carrying all the gratitude and hope and passion she felt. His answering kiss was a promise of protection, of partnership, of a future built together brick by brick, day by day. A future where a simple act of kindness could grow into the kind of love stories are written about. The kind that changes lives and heals old wounds and turns strangers into family. A love born under a battered Stetson in a dusty frontier town, strong enough to last a lifetime and beyond.